October 28th, 1897. The sun had not yet burned off the prairie mist above Butler Creek. The ground tasted cold and metallic in the mouths of the men who'd been up all night. Steam hissed from the boilers of the Phoenix Oil Company's rig, an iron skeleton of beams, pulleys, and greasy hemp rope that creaked like the throat of an old animal. Edwin B. Foster stood with his coat collar turned against the smell. Oil, sour and sweet, that clung to boot leather and breathed into the ribs of anyone who dared lean close. He was a tidy man, with a pocket watch and a habit of checking both. But tonight, even his watch seemed to pause. Around him, the crew moved like a single, rough organism. A driller named Tom Broom barked orders through a fog of breath. A derrick hand swung a sledge that glanced off the steel with a metallic ring. The driller's apprentice, a kid who still had sawdust in his nails, fed the cable while his hands shook. They'd been chasing the sound of the earth for months. Lines of seepage, an old trapper's tale, the rumor a cart driver had breathed into a barroom bourbon. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had already given Foster a blanket lease in March of 1896, a paper promise that read 10% royalty across its margins. The Osage would be paid for what came from beneath their feet. Men at the rig paid the clause in conversation like it was background noise. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, after weeks of grinding, something changed. There was a hiccup in the machinery, a drum that snagged and spat, and then a sound that froze the breath of every man on that muddy pad. A deep, wet roar, and the smell of putty and ancient plant matter blasted through the air. Mud and oil shot skyward in a black fountain, and for a heartbeat the prairie felt like it had a pulse of its own. They had struck. The first gush of crude was not a polite trickle, but a demand. It refused to be hidden again. Word traveled faster than the rails. Within days, horsemen carried the news toward Pawhuska. Telegraph wires hummed with the city's name. In other towns, men put down their tools and read the dispatches like sacred text. To the Osage people, who had kept the mineral rights to their lands through the treaty negotiations that followed removal and allotment, this was not an abstract paper calculation. It meant a steady, measurable thing. Royalty checks that would arrive with the seasons, a new kind of winter store. For families who had traded hides and horses for survival, this was, in one moment, incomprehensible abundance. Outside the reservation, the reaction was different and louder. Prospectors who had once called the Osage country waste and scorned its red clay and tall grass now arrived with brass instruments and sharp tongues. Political men from Fort Smith and Washington sniffed opportunity. Newspaper men with ink-stained collars came to sketch the so-called Indian millionaires they intended to mock. In the lumber frame saloons of Bartlesville, men laughed and called the Osage simple, naive, and easy marks. "Listen," one of them said, leaning forward with a cigar that smelled of cheap Havana. "We'll get the whole reservation for a song." Their laughter rolled off the wind into the tall prairie grass and settled like a gauntlet. They did not understand what it meant that the Osage had retained the mineral rights. They had not labored the treaties the way the Osage had. They had not watched their chiefs, like James Bigheart, argue with federal clerks over words that mattered. Surface versus subsurface. Possession versus usufruct. They mistook ceremony and quiet for ignorance. What they saw from the wagons and train stations was the immediate picture. Osage men in broad hats and beaded coats, women whose bracelets clinked like small bells, families with new wardrobes and children who rode to market in carriages. To the sneerers, It looked like easy money, a punchline. But the Osage were not improvising. They met the roar of the gush with a different kind of sound. Ledger pages, signatures, counsel. They watched the rigs, learned the language of leases and royalties, and began to place their own men, tribal attorneys, negotiators, and delegates into the rooms where decisions were made. The 10% royalty written on the government lease was suddenly not just a clause, but a lever. Where outsiders heard lease, the Osage heard contract. Language to be tested, reinforced, and wielded. On the night of the first strike, the camp drunk on smoke and crude and sudden hope. But the next morning, the sober work began. Men in black coats from the bureau arrived with papers. So did slick newcomers in polished boots, who had the bearing of a count. In the months that followed, the scoffing would continue in saloons and city papers. Give the Indians a windfall and see what they spend it on, one editorial sneered, unable to imagine a people who could read, compare, and insist. But beneath the laughter, beneath the cigar smoke and the political banter, something quieter was taking shape. The Osage learning the posture of power, drafting the first of many signatures that would turn mockery into leverage. They were about to teach a lesson that men in boardrooms had not expected to learn. January 1901. Pawhuska's main street clattered with hooves and wagon wheels slicked in winter mud. But the talk inside Murphy's general store was hotter than any stove. A cluster of out-of-town speculators leaned over a barrel full of nails, laughing so hard they rattled it. One held up a newspaper clipping that quoted an Osage councilman refusing to sign away mineral rights without legal review. "Legal review?" the man snorted. Did the blanket wearers hire Harvard men now? They didn't know how close to the truth they were. 3 days later, a carriage rolled through town bearing 2 men in dark wool coats, not preachers, not prospectors, but attorneys, hired by the Osage Tribal Council, on retainer. Their names would be whispered later in disbelief. Washington trained, versed in mineral leasing, patent law, contract enforcement. One of them, Henry Foster, brother of the original driller, had switched sides, now negotiating for the tribe. He walked into the agency office with a stack of documents thicker than a Bible and asked calmly for a meeting. From that day forward, no oilman signed a lease without facing 2 sets of eyes, one from the U.S. Indian agent and one from the Osage's own counsel. The change was immediate and infuriating. Where a prospector once slapped down $500 and rode away with a sloppy agreement, now he was told to come back with guarantees, escrow accounts, production reporting clauses. Some agreements were flatly denied. Others were renegotiated until the royalty share rose, not 10%, but 15%. Suddenly, the oilmen's laughter sounded different, tight, hollow. In a private letter, Railroad Baron Henry Kendall wrote to a colleague, "If they continue to uphold these royalty contracts, Standard Oil itself will have to negotiate on their terms." Another line followed, hastily scratched out and rewritten. "We underestimated them." Gravely. Across the country, titans of industry, men who carved mountains and bought senators like cattle, were forced to pause. Rockefeller himself received a briefing from his scouts on Indian Territory oil prospects. He did not laugh. He circled one line in red. "No lease contract is valid without Osage consent. Their attorneys are unyielding." In Pawhuska, no one heard that line being spoken aloud in distant boardrooms, but they felt it. Carriages grew finer. Custom-built homes rose on hilltops. Sequined shawls brushed against Parisian silk. A chief rode in a chauffeur-driven Pierce Arrow with a blanket over his lap and a cigar between his fingers, not because he wanted to impress the white men in town, but because he knew they were watching, and he could smell their discomfort. For the first time, the wealthiest men in America were not laughing at the Osage. They were calculating around them, and soon they would stop laughing altogether and start plotting. Summer 1918, Fairfax, Oklahoma. The cicadas buzzed like power lines in the trees, while the evening sun washed the prairie in molten orange. An Osage woman named Minnie Kyle stepped onto her porch in a silk dress imported from St. Louis, her bracelets clinking like distant bells. She carried no rifle and no fear. Why would she? She had more money in her bank account than most towns in the county combined. Across the dirt road, two white men leaned against a Model T, pretending to fix a tire, while their eyes never left her. "Imagine," one muttered, spitting into the dust. "All that cash, and not a clue what to do with it." His companion didn't laugh. He stared at Minnie the way a wolf watches a calf that wandered too far from the herd. There had always been resentment, but now it was turning into strategy. Guardianship laws. That was the first strike. County judges, nearly all white, petitioned Congress to protect the Osage from so-called financial mismanagement. The solution? Any Osage deemed incompetent, a label applied almost exclusively to full-blood tribal citizens, would be legally assigned a white guardian to oversee their spending. That sounded harmless on paper. In practice, it was a heist wearing a badge. A man who had never owned more than a mule could now sign checks drawn from another person's fortune. Guardians bought land in their wards' names, then leased it back to themselves. Some even billed their wards for services rendered, charging them for room, board, cigar supplies, even shoe polishing fees. The Osage saw it. They complained. They appealed. But money that large made ears go deaf. Then came marriage, sudden romances, oilmen's sons courting Osage women with flowers, ring boxes, and smiles sharpened like knives. In Fairfax, a white rancher named William Hale began inserting himself into every Osage social gathering, always generous, always laughing, always calculating. He encouraged his nephews to marry into wealthy Osage families. Love, he called it. Inheritance, others whispered. Soon after came death. At first they were explained away. A fever here, a carriage accident there, a man found beside the road, bullet hole in his skull, chalked up to unknown assailants. But by 1921, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Osage citizens, especially those with large head rights, were dying at a rate that turned funerals into routine gatherings. No investigations, no arrests, not inquiries. Inquiries. Local law enforcement shrugged and said it was Indian business. But it wasn't. It was calculated removal. And, for the first time since oil began to flow, the Osage were no longer being mocked. They were being hunted. In the tribal council chambers, tempers rose like storm winds. Leaders demanded federal intervention. Deputations traveled to Washington, demanding to speak directly with officials who could bypass the local corruption. One councilman slammed his fist on the table and declared, "They think we don't see it. They think we're sheep grazing in tall grass, but the wolves are in plain sight." Yet, even as fear crept through homesteads and mansions alike, there remained an ember of defiance. Because wealth had made them targets, but education had made them dangerous, too. Several Osage men and women had already attended boarding schools, colleges, even law programs. They read contracts better than the guardians who pretended to advise them. They tracked missing sums through ledgers with quiet fury. And soon, they would summon a force so large that even the men who planned the murders would flinch. The Osage had learned how to beat oil men at their own game. Now, they were about to learn how to make Washington listen. The Osage Tribal Council sent yet another delegation east, this time with photographs of the dead, names, dates, headright valuations. A list so damning it landed on the desk of the U.S. Bureau of Investigation, a young agency still struggling to define its purpose. Most federal offices saw Indian complaints as paperwork. This one read like a crime novel with missing chapters. J. Edgar Hoover, then only 28 years old and newly promoted to acting director, paced his office in Washington, fingers steepled under his chin. The Bureau needed a win, a case to prove its worth beyond chasing bootleggers and bankrupt clerks. The Osage murders offered something darker, a criminal conspiracy embedded in towns, courts, and churches. A test not of guns, but of honor. Hoover chose a man he trusted, former Texas Ranger Thomas Bruce White Sr., tall, mustached, calm as a pond before lightning. White arrived in Pawhuska dressed like a cattle buyer, hat low, coat plain. With him came a team not of fresh recruits but hardened agents, an undercover cowboy, a former insurance investigator, a black lawman who knew the difference between justice and procedure. They didn't badge flash, they didn't grandstand. They listened. Coffee shops, barber chairs, dance halls, church pews. They wrote nothing down but remembered everything. They watched who nodded when a widow walked by and who looked away. They noted which saloon quieted when certain names were spoken. And everywhere they turned, one name surfaced like oil from shale, William King Hale, the king of the Osage Hills. Technically a rancher, secretly a spider. His nephews had married into wealthy Osage families. His name appeared on insurance policies, loan guarantees, guardianship papers. His voice had the tone of a man who expected his words to become orders. When agents finally questioned him, he welcomed them with open arms and a smile that could butter cornbread. "Gentlemen," he said, extending cigars like offerings, "I want these murders solved as much as you do. Why, these poor Indians are like family to me." White nodded politely and kept digging. Soon the mask slipped. Paper trails revealed forged wills. Witnesses whispered of hired killers brought in from Kansas City. One confessed in a squeak of terror after being told the government would protect him. "Hale paid me," he stammered. "Paid us all. Said it was just business. Just business." Just business. The same phrase used in lease negotiations, in guardianship filings, in marriage contracts. Now, it was attached to murder. When the arrests came, they were swift and surgical. Hale, his nephew, the hired gun. Their lawyers howled that it was a mistake, a vendetta, a misunderstanding between cultures. But the Osage weren't silent this time. They sat in the courtroom, dressed in beadwork and broadcloth, feathers and fedoras, watching as the men who had pretended to protect them were shackled and led away. The jury convicted. The judge sentenced. The press wrote headlines that stunned the nation. Osage murders reveal massive oil conspiracy. Federal agents expose ring of predators in Oklahoma. And somewhere, far from that courtroom, in a marble-tiled office in New York, A secretary stood before John D. Rockefeller with a telegram in hand, summarizing the verdict. The oil baron read it silently. Then, according to legend, he spoke one line. "You don't play games with people who own the ground you walk on." For the first time since the wells began to gush, the balance had shifted. The Osage had been hunted. But now, the hunters had been named. And soon they would be remembered. By 1926, the trials were over. William Hale was sentenced to life. His hired killers followed him into iron cages. The newspapers hailed it as the first major triumph of the modern FBI. Washington congratulated itself. Hoover smiled for the cameras. But the Osage did not celebrate. They buried their dead, counted their headrights, and tightened their fists around their ledgers. Because the murders were not just crimes of greed, they were proof that wealth, without power, was a spotlight on the vulnerable. And the Osage were determined never to be vulnerable again. They rewrote the rules of engagement. From that point forward, every deal, whether made in a county clerk's office or a Manhattan skyscraper, had an Osage attorney present. Young men and women were sent east to colleges, then returned, wearing fine coats and fiercer minds. Tribal members began serving as auditors. Names the newspapers once mocked, now spoken with respect. In 2021, Martin Scorsese came to Osage County to film Killers of the Flower Moon, a reenactment of the darkest chapter in their history. Tribal elders sat with him beneath cottonwood shade and told him plainly, "Don't tell a story about our helplessness. Tell a story about our survival." Because that was the truth. The Osage were underestimated, mocked, targeted, hunted, but they were never helpless. They had negotiated their mineral rights before oil even bore their name. They had secured legal counsel before the first gush hit the sky. And when the wolves came wearing Sunday suits and wedding rings, they learned and adapted and pushed back with federal force sharper than any rifle. So when you hear their story, don't stop at the tragedy. See beyond the blood. See the contracts, the courtrooms, the signatures that said, "We will be heard." Because long before Rockefeller trembled, long before Hoover claimed credit, long before Hollywood arrived with cameras and caravans, the Osage Nation had already delivered the same lesson they give today. You can laugh at us, mock us, underestimate us, but if you sit at our table, you will negotiate.